Darwin's time. So one of the early things from the modern synthesis is a book on taking our modern, at least at this time to 1937, understanding of genetics and using that kind of language in our understanding to explain evolutionary processes and help make sense of them, okay? And so that's what Dostoevsky did in this book here, Genetics and the Origin of Species from 1937. Some other book works at this time were by Simpson in 1944, Tempo and Mode and Evolution. And whereas this book here talked about modern understandings of genetics in light of our evolutionary theory, this dealt a lot with paleontology. In Darwin's day, they knew a lot of stuff about fossils, but nothing compared to what people knew about by the mid-40s. And of course, nothing compared to what we know about today. A vast wealth of new material, new specimens, and new deposits being discovered, a new understanding. So what Simpson did was he takes modern understanding of paleontology and merges that with Darwinian understandings of evolution. And what he's showing is what we see in the world is completely consistent with Darwin's understanding of evolutionary processes, and they make actually more sense now because now we can talk about them in light of modern findings and things like that. And so we're taking and bridging the gap with modern genetics, modern paleontology, and then there's another important book by Ernst Mayr. I think this is 1942. That's the author of your first reading on Charles Darwin. It comes from a chapter in a book. And in 1942, so this is the paleontology, when he wrote this book, and it's called Systematics. And the Origin of Species. And so he's taking up to that time modern methods in systematics, modern understanding of systematics. What is systematics in biology? That's a field of biology that deals with what? Kind of part of it is taxonomy. What's taxonomy? Yeah. Right, classification, putting names on things and classifying them. But systematics is a little bit broader than that. Yeah, it deals with putting names on organisms. It deals with putting them at higher levels of classification. But it's also about working out their evolutionary relationships. And we'll see at this time and soon after that we use evolution in modern systematics now. And so what he did in the 40s was took our understanding of modern systematic processes and merged them and went back and looked at Darwin's understanding of evolutionary processes and used the language of systematics to help explain those things. And again, these are works both ways. So these are fields by which we understand how evolution works, and these were also fields, not as much this, but certainly these two things that Darwin used in solving problems. The information came from these fields and gave rise to patterns and processes that he used in his explanations. Also about this time and soon after, other people working in genetics, people like Haldane, Fisher, and Wright, we're looking at the genetic basis of evolution and explaining these processes in mathematical formulas. And so what they're doing is something that we could call population genetics. at before, and we'll do more, our understanding of evolutionary processes and our discussion of them is all couched in the language of genetics. And so what these people are explaining how evolution works, and they're explaining things like the processes of natural selection, how they work, but in the language of mathematics, and in the language of genetics, and the language of genes and alleles and things like that. So they'll be talking about processes like microevolution. Anybody have any idea what that is? Micro means what? Small, yeah, so small evolution, what might that be about? No. I never thought of saying that kind of an answer. Yeah, you're dealing with the evolution of small things, but I see your frame of thought. But it's actually not about the magnitude of the things that are changing, but it's the magnitude of the change itself. Okay? So we can look at populations through time, and in the language of population genetics, we can talk about changes in the frequencies of genes or actually more importantly, the frequencies of alleles. All right, Dylan, watch it. All right. Over time, but changes that aren't so great that if we look at some lineage and the frequencies of alleles are changing over time, the changes aren't so great that we would call the things at different periods of time different species. Okay? So, think of an example. What might be an example of microevolution? A real example or a made-up one? Well, how about like in people, the frequency of alleles that code for being able to digest lactose. So lactose is a sugar. It's in milk. It's milk sugar. What do you call people that don't digest lactose very well because they don't have a good functioning enzymes, lactases? They're lactose intolerant, okay? So that seems to be like a little problem, and so that must be the weird way, right? That must be the problematic way. That's actually the norm, okay? That's the normal condition. I mean, what other animal that you know of drinks milk as an adult? They don't do that. Normally, young mammals can deal with milk, deal with lactoses, and then they lose that ability as they become adults, and they no longer do such things, okay? But us humans, in some parts of the world in human history, some people, their cultures really dealt a lot with milk. Some places in northern Europe, and what kind of milk were they dealing with up there? Like something like reindeer and later cattle. And then some other parts in Africa, there are cultures in Africa and all they eat is milk and blood. And it's a pretty good system. I mean, it doesn't sound very good, but you grow cattle and they turn grass into these animals, but you don't kill them, you just keep them alive, and you milk them, and you get the milk, and then periodically you stab them in the neck, blood comes out, you mix that with the milk, and it's very nutritious. And then, of course, it heals, and you don't stab that one tomorrow. You let it rest and stuff. But you never get rid of them. It's not like butchering the cow, and then it's gone. Okay? You keep it, and it's a good way. So you can picture a few places on Earth where people, certain cultures, started using milk a lot as adults. In those places, was everybody the same? No, people varied. There were individuals. They're just natural variation in the genes and the alleles that code for maintaining active lactases throughout your life or not. In those places where people started deriving a lot of nutrition from milk, the people that were not lactose intolerant, which is a weird thing, on average, did better at living, gathering resources from milk, and living long enough and having a little bit more kids passing on the genes that code for what? Lactose tolerance. And so in those parts of the world, you see higher incidences of the alleles for lactose tolerance. Okay? So in human history, when people started in those places doing domestication of those animals and producing milk and living off that, the frequency of alleles for lactose tolerance goes up. Are those different species? They're not Homo sapiens anymore? No, they're still people. It's just in those pieces of populations or the species as a whole, frequencies of alleles have changed. Let's say it was 0.5% 50,000 years ago, and it's 12% today. Okay, so these didn't become a new species, but the frequency of alleles, at least for that one gene or multiple genes, if that's involved, have changed over time. That's what microevolution is. So it's change in frequencies of genes, or maybe more appropriately, the change in the frequencies of alleles over time in populations. Okay, and that comes from the language that we'll talk about of genetics, and really the language of population genetics, and looking at these processes at the level of genes and at the level of alleles. Okay, so we could say within populations or species. And then we have another thing that we could talk about that's kind of the same thing. But if you get large enough changes over time that you can classify the products, or maybe they multiply from one lineage to two lineage, and they're different from things that you have in the past, such that you could characterize them as different species or different families or different genera or different classes of organisms, that's larger scale change. And it's still ultimately based in changes in gene frequencies, but if those changes are so big that we classify the products as different species, that's what we would call macroevolution. Actually, this is more of what Charles Darwin was studying, and this is more what these people are talking about, is more microevolutionary processes, and this is what you talk about more when you're doing population genetics. So let's put a definition up here. So this is large evolutionary change. Enough to classify populations as different species or higher taxa. So we could talk about some lizard colonizing some island. And if it's been on that, once it's on that island and it does well enough to survive there and reproduce, natural selection is going to operate on that population on that island very differently than it operates on the population that's still on the mainland. So what's going to happen to the population of those lizards on the island relative to the population of lizards that's still on the mainland? What's going to happen to those two things relative to each other? Yeah, they're going to tend to, over the longer the time they're apart, they should become more and more what? Different. Yeah, anything that happens to the ones on the island population don't influence the mainland ones. Anything that happens on the mainland ones are not going to influence the island ones. So the longer they're apart, they're going to do their own things. They're evolving, changing independently. So this is taking place in the island population. This is taking place on the mainland population. But if it takes place long enough, or to a degree that they're so different that if we brought them together again, or put specimens on a table, we called them different species, we would say, oh, that's macroevolution. They're so different that we call them different things now, okay? And this you demonstrate, you could demonstrate it genetically, but this tends to be demonstrated more using morphology, okay? Which morphology is what? It's still, you're still looking at genes, right? But you're looking at the products of genes, okay? You're not looking at the genes directly. Yes?
Would we consider HIV micro?
I would, yeah. So that stuff that we were talking about of developing AZT resistance and or AZT susceptibility, that would all be microevolution. Now, we did look at a phylogeny that was broad enough where we had SIV, simian immunodeficiency viruses, and some of those lineages changed so much and got in other hosts that we call them something else. If you want to call that this, I'm okay with that. Okay? But then we're kind of talking about species and maybe applying it to viruses, which I don't know if that's appropriate or not. But I don't care about the appropriateness, that you have the right idea. So if they're big enough differences that we call them something else, then that's kind of what we're thinking about here.
And what about independent evolution? We call them diversification.
Yeah, if you're generating multiple lineages from one to more things, and that's the key here, and we'll see later on, he's talking about independent evolution, and we can easily envision that when we talk about a population on an island versus the parent population on the mainland. That's easy to picture in your mind, and that's certainly true, but we'll also talk about cases where it's not so obvious. But as long as they evolve independently, then all these processes that we're learning about and going to learn about are taking place in one population independent of other populations, and so they just become more and more different over time. So you still have transformation taking place, but it's independent transformation. They're going to become more and more different to the point that you would call them different things. Okay? So you're on the right track. That's the right ideas. So this modern synthesis really becomes something, an explanation, a modern explanation of how evolution works, but we're focusing on the level of genes and alleles to explain these processes, but fully realizing that it's the same processes that are taking place on larger scales that give rise to things like this, which is what Charles Darwin was more interested in. He wasn't interested in so much within population variation as he was across population variation and the origin of species. Remember, that was a problem, the species problem. What are these things? Where do they come from? And how did they get here, and why are they the way that they are? And so both of these things are taking place, but they're complementary, and as all this stuff that people learn doesn't negate what Charles Darwin was trying to say. It just makes it more clear and substantiates it in the eyes of people. And remember, I said right after The Origin of Species was published in 1859, people got that evolution took place. But it took them until these times here that people could really understand how natural selection works, because now people can demonstrate it in the language of mathematics and in the language of genes and alleles, that people are starting to get more of a handle on. That kind of makes sense? And then this hasn't stopped here in the 40s and 50s. People have also come up with some fairly new and also big ideas that modify what we would call parts of the modern synthesis and modify our understandings. One of the things about people's understanding of how evolution worked, even up to this time, is people often thought of it as being a slow, gradual process, just like, remember, applying uniformitarianism to biological processes and small processes that make small changes in short amounts of time can make big changes in big amounts of time, okay? That's what would be called gradualism. And if Darwin came into the door and we talked to him, we would call him a gradualist. That's how he thought evolution proceeded. But as people started looking at the fossil record, sometimes you see fairly big changes in relatively short amounts of time. What's one explanation for that? So you're looking at the fossil record, you're looking at something changing through time, and it stays relatively the same for a while, and then it changes dramatically in a short amount of time. What's one explanation for that?
Volcano.
Yeah, well, actually, your answers are more toward the right explanation. I'm thinking of one that also could be right, yeah.
Different type of different mechanism.
Well, that's a possibility. Maybe there are other mechanisms by which evolution takes place, and maybe it's not always gradual. But the first thing I was getting at is maybe it's just that your fossil record is incomplete, okay? It's not perfect. You could be missing lots of fossils. You've never found them, or they don't exist for that period between that jumps. That's one possibility. But as people got a better handle on the fossil record, it really looks, and Simpson writes about this, it really looks like there are some situations where lineages change relatively quickly in relative short amounts of time. Now, I'm talking days, I'm not talking weeks, I'm not talking hundreds of years, I'm not talking even thousands of years. I'm talking about many thousands of years to hundreds of thousands of years, but relative to millions and hundreds of millions, things can change fairly quickly in relatively short amounts of time. This is a hypothesis called punctuated equilibrium hypothesis. And this is by Niles Eldridge and Stephen J. Gould in 1972. And this is that sometimes lineages don't always change only gradually. They can change in fits and starts. Why might that take place? And then somebody over here said something that was useful. Yeah. Haven't we learned that these populations are products of the environment? And as the environment changes, lineages change, okay? So as the environment changes, characteristics of lineages change, they transform and they diversify. But is environmental change always slow and gradual? No, sometimes it does change relatively quickly over short amounts of time. It's like what we're seeing now with climate change. So yeah, the temperatures on Earth have changed throughout the history of the Earth. And there have been some times that have been much warmer than now. There have been times that are much colder than now. But right now it's changing, it's getting warmer, but it's getting warmer on a relatively small time frame. And you can look at organisms, and organisms are changing right before our eyes, and they're changing relatively quickly. If we were to go to the future and look back, we would see lineages of organisms going through time, staying relatively similar for long periods of time, and then exhibiting large changes associated with large environmental changes. We also have to keep in mind, all throughout the rest of the semester, what are some very important aspects of the environment that you tend not to think of, but they're very influential in influencing change in lineages. It's not just the physical environment. It's also what? The biological environment. It's the other organisms. Okay? Things like predators, things like prey, things like parasites, things like commensals, things that you form mutualistic relationships in. Other organisms can change, and they beget changes in other lineages, and sometimes they change rapidly. What happens if some organism is fairly tied to its prey and the prey goes extinct? Well, the predator might what? Go extinct. Or it might switch to some other prey item, but that might beget some fairly substantial changes in their characteristics if they continue to exist. And then if you went back and looked at them, they would look like they stayed relatively similar for a while and then changed fairly quickly. It might be indicative of some larger magnitude change in their environment. So you're right. If the environment changes dramatically, you might expect that. Okay? So which one is right? Gradualism or punctuated equilibrium? So the equilibrium is relatively similar for a while and then marked by punctuated changes in short amounts of time. Which one's right?
No.
Yeah, are there lineages that change via gradualism? Sure. Are there lineages that apparently exhibit punctuated changes? Sure, both of those things. Could that happen in one lineage? Sure, okay? So all those things are possible. It's just that people realize it isn't always one way, and the way that we tend to talk about it is in the language of gradualism, but yeah, you can get real changes in fairly short amounts of time. Okay? Some other fairly new ideas about how evolution works have to deal with the levels at which, or what is natural selection operating on? Charles Darwin would say that natural selection operates on populations of individuals, and it's individuals that reproduce or don't reproduce, and the ones that reproduce because they have certain characteristics are the ones that perpetuate some genes at the expense of other genes. That makes sense, right? So we tend to think of natural selection operating on the level of individuals, okay? But, we'll talk about this more later, do individuals really reproduce themselves? They don't. Remember we talked about your parents. You're a lot like your parents, but you're not exactly like your parents. They didn't reproduce themselves. They didn't make another one of themselves. Okay? So if we're talking about the perpetuation of things, and natural selection either favoring or working against something, what is really getting perpetuated, or what is really being reproduced or not reproduced? Huh? Wait, say loud. Yes. Aren't those the only things that are making more of themselves that are just like themselves?
Yeah.
Yes. So people like Richard Dawkins writes about things like the selfish gene. And it's genes that are the only things that reproduce themselves and make more of themselves. So really natural selection is operating on the level of genes. It's just that there are other levels through which genes get perpetuated. So there are vehicles by which genes get perpetuated. The most common one being individuals. So genes exist in individuals. They code for their directions for building these individuals that perpetuate those genes. We'll see later on in the semester that we don't have to just limit ourselves to individuals. There is selection that operates on vehicles above the level of individuals, like groups. And we'll talk about situations where genes code for group level emergent properties. Remember we talked about emergent properties? There are genes that code for group level emergent properties that perpetuate genes that do that. Okay? And so we can really learn a lot about how evolution works by looking at the level of genes. And those are the things that are making more of themselves, and the ones that are good at doing that get perpetuated, and the ones that aren't so good at doing that, their proportions go down or they disappear. But there's so many, many different ways that these genes can do that. Okay? Yeah.
So what about like things that can't clone themselves? Like there are like sunflowers, they can just.
Yeah, even some things that clone themselves, they've already had some changes take place. But yeah, like we'll see throughout the class, all these things have exceptions, and things tend to not make more of themselves. But there are ways for things to reproduce asexually, and in effect, they're making more of themselves. In some cases, though, the proportions of alleles in one individual are different than proportions of genes in another individual, but they're pretty close to making more of themselves. Okay? But these genes have all kinds of ingenious ways of coding for perpetuating themselves. One of them is coding for individual organisms that do things that perpetuate those genes. But when you're looking just at the level of the genes, when he talks about selfish genes, anything a gene can do that makes it more successful at making more copies of itself and passing itself along, natural selection should favor that. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. Some are some pretty awful ways that are at the expense of other organisms and very competitive ways, but there are other ways that genes can be selfish, and one of them is by cooperating. Okay, so multiple genes can cooperate to make more of themselves. In fact, isn't that what's going on in your body? You don't just have one gene, you have a few tens of thousands of genes that are all doing what? In a sense, they're cooperating to build a vehicle to perpetuate themselves. So the genes that don't cooperate very well end up generating individuals that aren't so good at living and reproducing and passing on those very genes. Again, stuff we'll talk about later, but the point here is we don't really have to, don't limit yourself or realize that we probably shouldn't think of the individual as the unit of selection. We really should think of the gene as the unit of selection. And when you do that, it helps explain a lot of things. And even when you get down to the genetic level, there are genes that move around, and there are genes that do very selfish things. You know, when you talk about independent assortment of chromosomes in meiosis, there are genes that code for getting picked more than 50-50. If you're a gene sequence that codes for not just getting picked at random, but your chromosome when you're making gametes gets picked more than 50-50, wouldn't that gene get perpetuated more? Yeah, and so those things exist. Those have come into being, and you can see how they would get perpetuated. Okay? So it's pretty neat and very interesting to look at it that way. And all of this helps make sense of evolution, our processes going back to Darwin's time. And so we'll talk about things like units of selection later in this class, and we'll talk about not just individual selection, but we'll talk, there are cases where there are emergent properties of groups, okay, and societies, and things like colonies and stuff like that, have genes that code for group level characteristics that natural selection can operate on and perpetuate these things for these emergent properties. Also, we've seen that certainly the most important mechanism by which frequencies of alleles and genes change over time is natural selection, and that's the means by which adaptations, characteristics that confer some benefit on one individual versus another individual, that main mechanism is natural selection. But are there other mechanisms by which frequencies of alleles can change over time in a population that's not natural selection? Is there anything that could do that? Yeah. Well, yes, certainly that's true, because mutations take place, and even if an A becomes a G, if that's different to make it from allele A that does one thing to allele B that does something else, didn't you just change the frequency of alleles? A went down, B went up. But probably not very much, right? Unless what? The frequency didn't change very much. A small change doesn't make a very big change in overall frequency unless the overall pile of things is what? Small. So if there's 1 million things and you change one from one thing to another, the frequency or the proportion maybe go from 50 to 50-50 to 50.00001 and 49.99999. It changed, but it wasn't a very big change. What if one thing changes into something else and you only have 4 of them? The proportion is what? Much greater, okay? So if you can go from 50% red alleles to 50% blue alleles, if one of those red ones becomes a green, now what happened? your 50% red just became only 25%. That's a big deal. So you can have large-scale changes in populations that happen. That's not natural selection. Those things can happen by chance, and that's something that's called, again, something we're going to talk about later in this class. I'm just talking about it now because as part of this modern synthesis and beyond, people are learning of other processes by which the frequencies of alleles can change over time in populations, and it's not just natural selection. You can have changes in gene frequencies over time strictly by chance, okay? But for chance to have a good chance to have an effect, you really have to deal with small populations. So later on when we spend time talking about genetic drift, we'll see that the possibility for genetic drift to make a significant impact or have a significant influence, we've got to somehow deal with small populations. It's a sampling problem, okay? It's like, we could think of an example in this room. If there was an earthquake and the roof caved in and smashed a whole bunch of us, almost everybody in here, we'll just say, has brown-black hair, okay? So the alleles for very dark hair are very common in here. I don't see anybody with bright red hair, or your hair is kind of light back there. So you could be the only person in here. We'll just say we'll make it real simple. Your hair color is coded for by multiple genes. Again, something we'll talk about later, but let's say it's real simple, and we only have two alleles, black hair and blonde hair, okay? And we'll say that the blonde hair right now in this room is at 1%, and the other 99% are the black haired alleles. You okay with that? The roof falls in and it smashes most of the people in here in the room, and 3 people survive, and it's you survive, and 2 other people with dark hair survive. Now the frequency, we'll say everybody in here is homozygous for the alleles that they have. So we just went from 1% blonde-haired alleles to 30% blonde-haired alleles in our situation here. Did her surviving the earthquake and the roof falling in have anything to do with her hair being blonde? Well, we know that, well, maybe it might, because don't blonde-haired people have real thick skulls? You know, it's hard to get anything across to them. Okay, well, let's say that that's not the case, but if Houge, yeah, she's already got her fist ready. She wants to see how thick my skull is. But you get the point. If who lived and who died had nothing to do with respect to that particular alleles, which ones you had, and that resulted in a change, that's a change by chance, that's genetic drift, okay? There are other genes, though, that might code for the thickness of your skull, and if people that had the genes that coded for thicker skulls, because they had thicker skulls, tend to survive the roof collapsing more than other people, is that genetic drift? No. Okay? That's regular selection. But you can think of these situations where chance can change allele frequencies, but you really have to deal with small populations. Again, we'll see those real-life situations later. The point here being is that people have realized that there are other means by which allele frequencies or evolution takes place, and it's not just natural selection. Although overwhelmingly, natural selection is the principal mechanism by which this change takes place, and it's certainly the mechanism that generates things like adaptations. All right? So many of these things we're going to come back to later. Let me. Anybody have any questions about? This is really the end of our discussion of the evolution of, or the development of evolutionary thought. We're up to modern times, and it's very different than what we talked about back in Greek philosopher times. Does anybody have any questions about this before we move on?
What was the definition for punctuated equilibrium?
Oh, it's changes in lineages And it's marked by relatively long periods of stasis, or relative stasis, they don't stay the same, but then marked by fairly large changes punctuated changes in fairly short amounts of time. Yeah, no, I can't. Let me see if I wrote something down that might be helpful. Not really. It's descriptive of change in a lineage of organisms over time, where you have relatively long periods of time of minor change, gradualism, but that overall change in that lineage is marked by episodes or events of relatively large change in relatively short amounts of time. Does that help?
Okay.
If that doesn't work and you give me a reminder, I'll come up with a good one and write it on the board on Monday. Or you can look in your book. I bet, even in the glossary, I bet it says something that's much more succinct than what I said. Okay, any other questions? What I want to do now is go back and look at some things that were very central to the development of this whole understanding that we're talking about. So today I want to look a little bit at, we're going to review some of the things that we talked about in some pictures that have the words on them that I didn't write on the board, but now you have them, because those things are all on the Moodle site, so it's reiterating stuff that we talked about, but now you have it in a clear fashion. And then today I want to spend a little time talking about, again, what natural selection is, and then what artificial selection is. And then when we come back, I'm going to talk about some examples of natural selection, and then we're going to look at those big influences on people like Darwin. We're going to look at comparative anatomy, we're going to look at paleontology, and we're going to look at biogeography a little bit. So get a better handle on some of these things that we were talking about. So let me make this thing go on. Laptop. Okay, half time. You like both of them off or just one? Okay. Comes from a great story of this whaling ship, the Essex. And there's a great book, you could read about it, it's better than the movie. But on that trip, they visited the Galapagos Islands. And in those days, people visited the Galapagos Islands to collect tortoises. And why did they collect them? To eat, yeah, they were great. You go out, you get two people with big, poles, and you can tie these tortoises on these poles. They weigh hundreds of pounds. You can take them back to the ship, you can turn them upside down, and they stay alive for months. And so it's like fresh food. So they visited that. But there was a guy on that ship that thought it was funny, and he lit the island on fire. And for days of sailing, they could look back and you could see that island, one of those Galapagos Islands, on fire. And I thought it was Charles Island. They didn't do that in the movie, but that's people would visit these islands. And they also would come to these islands and let stuff go. They would let things like goats go, because then you could come back to them later and there would be more goats that you could harvest and use as food. But like I said, it would have been great for him to have collected these, and they did get these things for food, but they ended up just throwing the shells overboard. But they're still there, and you can go and see them. And again, you can tell what island they're from their morphology. And we even know where they came from. They came from South America, and there are tortoises there that would have been representative of the lineages that gave rise, to the tortoises on these islands. How did they get there? What's the chance of getting there? Real small, okay? But stuff gets to islands because there are certain kinds of things. And remember I said this is one of the things that Charles Darwin studied a tremendous amount of time doing experiments, particularly on seeds. So some seeds can get to islands by being blown in the wind. Others can end up moving in the water, but if you move in salt water, only things that can deal with salt water. Lots of stuff you put in salt water and it dies. Those kinds of things you don't end up with on islands. And so if you look at the vegetation on islands, you tend to see things that have very large dispersal ability. And things that have poor dispersal ability, they're not on islands. So islands have very peculiar floras and faunas, and people like Darwin and Wallace saw this, and those are the kinds of things that led them to their understandings. But these things probably got out there on rafts of vegetation and soil, and that's something that happens constantly. You ever get a chance to go to visit the Amazon River, even way up there in Peru? If you just watch the river, it is constantly taking islands of soil, some with trees on them, and plants and logs, and they're always going down river, and those get pumped out to the sea. What happens to the organisms on there? Almost all of them die. But if you're constantly pumping these things out, day and night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're just pumping this stuff out into the oceans. Some of them make it somewhere. And some of those things end up on islands where there's enough whatever they need to survive there. So there are different kinds of islands. There are continental islands that, remember we talked about pieces of the earth moving? Something we'll talk about when we deal with biogeography. Sometimes pieces of the earth move away from bigger pieces and they become islands. And they carry with them the things that are on them. The other kinds of islands, like the Galapagos Islands, are oceanic islands. They come up through volcanic activity from below, and then they rise up above the level of the sea, and what's living on them? Absolutely nothing. Everything on those islands had to get there from somewhere else. Okay? Another great example are the Hawaiian Islands. All the same stuff took place on the Hawaiian Islands. He didn't go there. That would have been great. If he only went to the Hawaiian Islands, he would have learned the same thing. It's the same processes. But organisms from different places, different kinds of organisms, and once they get there, they do their own thing and become their own things. So again, if you want to see places where there's organisms that live nowhere else on Earth, go to islands, because the things that are there are only there. Okay, and you can look at the patterns. So there are some organisms that have large dispersal ability, like birds, and you tend to see birds fairly well represented on islands of some kinds, and other things not so much. So like, how about amphibians? You expect those are represented very well on oceanic islands? They don't do well in seawater. They don't fly, okay? So some of these are predictable patterns, and then if you make predictions, you can go out there and test them by looking at the things on real islands to understand these processes. Here's some other organisms that Charles Darwin collected, but he really didn't spend much time in elucidating what was going on here, even until much later. But he brought his specimens back and he gave them to an ornithologist. I think his first name was John, last name was Gould, and they worked up these birds. And there are about a dozen species of these little, they're finch-like birds, but they're not finches. They're from another group of birds. And they're on these islands, and each island has its own complement of these birds. And they're really kind of the same kind of bird, but they're all different. They've all been modified over time to do different things and exploit different resources. So some of them have really, probably the really big drivers in the changes of the morphology of these lineages are what they eat. So there are resources on these islands, and you can picture these islands as at one time having no small birds, and then a kind of small bird gets there, enough to reproduce, multiple individuals or even one individual that has eggs, and they reproduce. There are no other small birds out there doing small birdie things, whatever they do. And so those ways of potentially making a living are available. And these birds over time filled those jobs. And so you have ones that eat seeds that are really big and hard to deal with, and others eating other kinds of seeds that are smaller and easier to deal with. Others that catch insects or glean insects off of trees and under bark. And there's even a bird on the island that uses tools. So it breaks off pieces of bark and picks down into the holes of wood burrowing insects using cactus spines and little sticks. It uses it as a tool. These birds exist nowhere else except on the Galapagos Islands. Some of the bigger islands have multiple species. Some of the smaller islands only have one. But what it appears to visitors to these islands is that they have relatives on the mainland of South America, and one of those got to these places and became something different. And then this is, if you read The Origin of Species, remember I said it's kind of hard reading, it's a little bit dry, and so when you read books like that, you hope for pictures, you know, stuff to color in and things like that. This is the only illustration in the entirety of The Origin of Species. What is this? What are these things and what is the point of it? Yeah, he didn't call them that, but these are phylogenetic trees. These are lineages doing what? Actually, in this diagram, he's trying to explain to you, the reader, what lineages do. And in this diagram, they're doing three things. They transform, they diversify, and what's taking place a lot? Extinction. See all these little whiskers on here? That's all extinction. And he has little labels down here, just like what we did. And so he was trying to explain to the reader exactly what's going on. And since this is really the beginning of real evolutionary biology, these are the first phylogenetic trees. Now, people drew trees in the past and put organisms on them to describe relationships, but these are the first ones that really are talking about evolving, changing, and diversifying lineages. And he's using an illustration and words to do this, and it works very well. And then in our textbook, there must be 100 phylogenies in there. And again, that's what we're supposed to think. When you're thinking of populations and organisms evolving and changing over time, this is the pictures you're supposed to have in your head. This is how the process works. And here's a bit. Remember this guy? I think Darwin's beard was better than this. And this is a pretty good beard. What did he do? To review? He also figured out the mechanism of natural selection. Yeah. Very interesting character. Oh, there's also another great beard, Uncle Si from Duck Dynasty. Gotta put his picture in here. His beard is better than Darwin. I'd like to grow one of those really long beards, but you don't just get there overnight. That's gradualism, yeah. You gotta go through a long, uncomfortable period. The most uncomfortable being my wife said, no way. Too bad. Okay, I forgot, Uncle Si was on there, that's great. Okay, so here, this is stuff that we drew on the board, scribbly. Here it's nice and clean. Here is what natural selection, how it takes place. Remember, individuals, they're not all the same. Again, also, these things are directly observable facts. You can go do it. If you don't believe what I put up here, that's a good thing about science. Go out and look at it yourself. Either go and read something that somebody else wrote that you trust more than me, or go out there and do it yourself. You go out to populations of organisms, they're not all the same, they vary. Lots of that variation is heritable. In modern language, it's coded for in genes. Okay? How about, is there variability among organisms that's not coded for in genes? Is there variability in populations that's not coded for in genes? There's nobody in here, usually I have somebody in here that has green hair or blue hair. That's variability in our classroom, right? But I don't think that's coded for in their genes. That's coded in hair dye or whatever you do to make your hair blue, okay? Can natural selection operate on that? No. For natural selection to work, it can only operate on things that are coded for, genetically based things. So there are characteristics that aren't coded for in your genes, and natural selection can't operate on those things. Okay? Some of those might be things that you learn. So natural selection can operate on the genes that code for your capacity to learn things, but what you learn, those are acquired things, like dyeing your hair, and natural selection doesn't operate on those. So this heritable thing is important. And then, remember what he got from Malthus, all individuals aren't the same with respect to their realized contribution to the next generation. They don't all pass on their genes at the same level. That varies from individual to individual. And so, this is the differential reproduction. So if this survival and reproduction of individuals is not random, but it's tied to that variation that's based in genes, okay, this differential reproduction, then these characteristics in these lineages are naturally selected, and the frequency of those genes, or the frequency of those traits that are based in genes, will change over time, and that kind of change in populations is called what? That's our class. That's what evolution is. And again, you read these things, and it can't not happen this way. It has to happen. Okay, there's no way that giving these things that are real, it can't not be that way. And that's what is so intuitively simple about it. And like I said the other day, there were a lot of people in 1859 that said, "God, how come I couldn't figure that out? It was right in front of my face." And part of it is even friends of Darwin who are stuck with old ideas in their head, and if they think that's how the world works, it makes it very difficult to see things, even if people put them right in front of your face, okay? Even to very smart people, and we do that today, okay? And so, therefore, the composition of these characteristics is, again, at a population level, change from one generation to the next, and then this is what Darwin talked about. Natural selection is the mechanism that produces descent, change over time in populations, with modification. All right, so now you've got that for you. Okay? Now, this is the same stuff, but in the language of the modern synthesis. And you'll see it a little bit different, because here we're going to use words like alleles and genes. Charles Darwin comes through the door. He has no idea what you're talking about. These are words for today, and these are words from the 1900s. And these things he would understand them because you could explain them to him, but he didn't know about that. And so these are the tenets of the modern synthesis. So they're all written out for you here, but again, it's changes in allele frequencies. Again, that code for morphological, behavioral, biochemical characteristics that we can see, and we think of those as the phenotypes, but this is changes in genotypes. And it's an inevitable consequence of these processes. Okay? Some examples. This is actually an introduced beetle here. It's called the Asian multicolored lady beetle. And again, it comes from Asia. There's lots of them that have been introduced here on purpose for biological control, because they tend to eat plant pests that people don't want. And you can see these here when it gets, if we have winter ever again, you can go in the stairwells in this building, in these science buildings, because they're open to the outside, and in the winter go and look up in the corners. They tend to congregate, this species of beetle. It's called Harmonia acerbitis. And they congregate up in the corners, and they'll do that in people's houses and garages. And because of that, some people think of them, they're kind of like a pest, because too many of them come into their house at once. So here's what an individual looks like from these populations that are here. But if we look at, oh, this is the wrong. This isn't even my. One of the times I came to one of these classrooms, and I was hunting all over the room for the buttons that ran the thing. You know, I spent about 10 minutes. Then some wise ass in the front said, "Why don't you pull the string?" They just had strings. So me pushing that button is no big stretch. How many species of ladybird beetle or lady beetle are here in this picture? One. Okay. So we talk about individuals within a population, they're not all the same. Well, a lot of times those non-sameness characteristics are things that aren't really obvious to you. In people, it's very obvious. When we start talking about human society and development of human beings, one of the things that's extremely important to us is the communication of ideas and emotions and recognition, and that's a big reason why we all have different faces, okay? But in some organisms, you see this patterns that are on its body, particularly the color patterns on the elytra, the first pair of wings in beetles that are very hard and cover the membranous flight wings. These color ones can mate with these can mate with these, anybody can mate with anyone. They're just an example of a variable, at least one that you can see with your eyes, a very variable species of organism. So this is a good example of not all the individuals are the same. Here's another kind of neat example. These are stomachs in human beings. So this is something you don't see your friend's stomach every day. But if we were to sacrifice, well, we got to have some people to still be around in the class, but like a third of the people in here, and cut the stomachs out, and then wash, hose them out and get them clean so it's not so gross, and lay them out on the table. Would they all be the same? No, they're different. Okay, and here's different human stomachs. This is me on Saturday. Get a chance to listen a lot. Again, variability within a species in characteristics. People aren't all the same. Here's a real-life example of natural selection. Some organisms reproduce fast enough that within human history, you can see them change, and you can understand the selection pressures that resulted in those changes. So this is another kind of insect that's a true bug. It's in the order Hemiptera. This is in the genus Jodera. I think it's called Hematolina. It's a soapberry bug. And these things live here in Los Angeles, but they also live in Florida. And they feed on the seeds inside these fruits of this flat-potted golden rain tree. And so, actually, this is their natural host. No, this is their natural host. This is their natural host. And so they've been feeding on this for a long time. Not an individual, but as a species, as a population. And they have mouth part lengths. This whole order of insects, they're called sucking insects. Their mouth parts, instead of chewing like this, it's the same pieces, but instead of short mandibles, they're long and folded over each other, and they make a tube, and they stick them into things, mostly plants. Some of them stick them into other insects, some stick them into other animals, some stick them into people. Anybody got bed bugs at home? Yeah, some of you do. That's what they do. So these have mouth parts that work for this size fruit. Well, not that long ago, people introduced another plant that was close enough to this plant that these insects could also eat. And the number of these plants went down because of conversion of land and probably competition with this plant. And so the rules of the game changed. The common plant that they were feeding on had a much smaller fruit. And so over time, individuals that tended to have smaller mouth parts, because they tended to have genes and allele combinations, genes and alleles that coded for smaller mouth parts, on average tended to do better at exploiting this particular resource and living longer and passing on their genes for smaller mouth parts just relatively more than those with the longer mouth parts. Did individual insects change? No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about change in average mouth part length in this particular species over time. And you can see that over time, from the 1800s till today, mouth part length has gone down. How do we know what mouth part lengths they had in 1900? This is ridiculous. No, better than fossils. Huh? Not even a historical fact. It's something directly observable. How can you measure the mouth part length of an insect that lived in 1900? No, better than that. Specimens. This is my day job. This is my night job. My day job is I take care of our school's collections. Remember that bird I brought in here? That's not from 2016. That's from, I think that was probably early 2000s, 2005 or something like that. So people have been collecting specimens and keeping them in museums, universities, and private collections. And so people went back and looked at old specimens that have information on them that said where they were collected, by who, and what date, and they measured the mouthparts. So yeah, that's actually not a historical fact. It's a really a directly observable fact if you believe what's written on the label. So people went back and looked at mouthpart length in these insects, and then look at them in modern times, both in specimens, and you go out there and catch them yourself. That change is this microevolution or macroevolution? Yeah, it's microevolution. Okay. Could they go back to larger mouthparts?
Yeah.
How might that take place? Yeah, go cut these down. Reintroduce these there. Maybe this is some important plant. You want to conserve it, you could perpetuate it and grow it. Yeah, we would, just like the AZT thing would go back and forth, you would expect, and this would probably be the case, and this has been demonstrated in other organisms with other characteristics, they'll go back the other way. It's not a unidirectional thing. It follows the environment. If the environment changes so much that no individuals can deal with it, and they all don't reproduce anymore, that's extinction. That species would be gone. Let me just run through these. So those tenets of the modern synthesis, I'm not going to read these, but again, it's what we talk about with respect to natural selection and evolutionary processes, but using the language of genetics, and using the language that you, as semi-educated citizens, and you're going to school, you're in a biology department. I think everybody, isn't genetics one of the core courses that you all have to take? Yeah, like some of you are in it now. So these words, like what I wrote on the first day, these words just mean stuff. So you have these. I think this is a good place to, I'm just going to run to start. And so when we come back on Monday, we'll look at some examples of and look at. We said the selective force was what? Nature, the environment. Don't just think of the physical environment. Remember the biological environment that often plays a much more, a stronger role in applying selective forces to things. But then in artificial selection, the selective force was human beings. We also said that change can be enacted faster with artificial selection than you typically see in natural selection. And why was that?
Because you control it?
Yeah, you control it, and it's actually a lot, it's not just a on average kind of thing, or a tipping the scales a little bit in favor of one characteristic that's coded for by one allele or something. In artificial selection, you could really tip the scales really far. We were talking about, breeding things to get a breed of cats or something with white hair, and only the ones that exhibit some or lots of white hair, because they have the genes and the alleles and the allele combinations for that, you only let those breed. It's not just you let them breed a little bit more than the ones with the dark hair, you only let those things breed. And so you're fairly quickly driving this lineage, this population of things, to have lots of the genes and alleles and allele combinations for that character that you want. And in human history, this is what people have done, and also they've done it without seeing the end product. They're just reproducing and growing things, typically domesticated animals and plants, that have characteristics that they want. And so every generation they keep letting reproduce or actively propagating the things that have the characteristics that you most want. And so over the years, again, you perpetuate the genes and alleles. They don't know anything about genetics, but that's what they're doing. They're just picking the characters, the phenotypic characters that they like, but those are coded for in their genotypes, the organism's genotypes. And so you're just perpetuating those genes and alleles for these things that you want and driving them into something that meets human needs. Okay, so that's what's going on in artificial selection. Let's look at a couple of examples. picture? Okay, so here's a real life example. These are some vegetables that humans eat, and these are some vegetables that humans made. So 10,000 years ago, there was nothing that you would recognize as cauliflower. Didn't exist. People made it, but they didn't make it from nothing. They made it from something else. They made it from a plant that very similar species to this are introduced here in Southern California. You see them growing on our hillsides. If we ever get rain in the spring times, you see these plants growing there. These are also plants that grew in the Old World and in the northeastern part of the Mediterranean. And people would harvest wild parts from these plants, but then they also started to grow them themselves, and then they picked and chose characteristics that different ones had and perpetuated those, and in doing so they produced these plants for different characteristics. So when you eat broccoli and cauliflower, what part do you eat? The what? It's called the inflorescence. So it's this structure here that produces the flowers. So just grow broccoli in your garden sometime, but don't cut it and eat it, just let it go. And you'll see all of these, this inflorescence has really thousands of flowers on it. They're small and then they'll bloom. And so what you're eating are the flowers before they open up in broccoli. Or if you let it sit around too long, then it will start getting flowers on it. And then if you let it sit around even longer than that, then it turns moldy, and then no, it's so good then. The same thing on these cauliflowers, but they really don't bloom. Okay, these are modified inflorescences, but they're very fleshy and they're flavorful. So this is perpetuating big, flavorful inflorescences that people eat. On cabbages, what's the characteristics that's really enhanced there? It's the leaves, yeah. So you eat the leaves. And I grow cabbages because they're easy, but when they get really big, they're really dense head of leaves, just growing one over the other. So you can cut them up, and you're eating the modified leaves. And some of the things that people have selected for here are big leaves, succulent leaves, somewhat tasty leaves, but also leaves that aren't so bitter. So you can eat these plants. In the springtime when it rains, you can go up to the hill and you can take these plants and you can eat them. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the leaves. They're not that great. You know, they're pretty bitter. Okay? But people have chosen variants that aren't so bitter. So they eat those things here. The same thing with Brussels sprouts. These are just lateral shoots. And they're very much like little cabbages on the side of this main stem here. This stuff, I don't know why people, this stuff's nasty. This stuff's this stuff's awful. But it's also the leaves. Okay, these are, it's as if they tried to grow something that was super bitter and awful. And they succeeded. Yeah. And then there's this thing here, which is the stem, and I've never eaten this before, I don't know what you do with it. But this is really the stem that's been modified and become more succulent. The point being, from this, people made these things via artificial selection. Again, if you didn't know that and you looked at these things, you would think they were all very different species of plants. Okay? And so in a very short amount of time, even on the order of several hundred years, people can make things that are very different from other things. Okay? So here's the same diagram showing the same kinds of things from this wild ancestor over here, this mustard, comes these more familiar plants and the parts that are accentuated and chosen by people. And we'll talk about really what's going on here, but you can kind of see what's going on here already. People are perpetuating certain characteristics that are expressed as phenotypes by inadvertently choosing genotypes of plants and also keeping them separate. Okay, if these white fleshy inflorescences are something that you want, you keep these separate from these other plants that have other characteristics. You make them do their own thing, okay? And so you don't let them mix and match, because then you will water down some of these characteristics that you're after. And so we'll see when we talk about the development of real species in nature, that's often a very key thing, is to get them operating independently. And we'll even see when we're talking about what species are and definitions of species, that's the really key important thing, is this independence. How we achieve that, there's lots of different ways to achieve that, but the independence is the key thing. This is another really nice example. This is corn, okay? Again, people made this. It wasn't very long ago that these things didn't exist. Who made these?
Mine.
Yeah, and the southern Aztec, and it was Mesoamericans, okay? They made this from this plant here, teosinte, and this still exists. The wild plant still exists, but it's really different from this. And also, is there only one kind of corn?
No.
No, there's probably hundreds of kinds of corn. If you don't believe me, I bought corn. Hey, it's real cheap, and the truck, parked on the side of Nordhoff, in the summer. And so you buy that stuff and you take it home and you cook it thinking you're eating sweet corn, and it's corn that you're supposed to use to make tamales and stuff like that. It's awful. Yeah, it's horse corn. It's like you feed horses, but you're supposed to cook it in a different way. It has different characteristics than sweet corn. Then you don't have to cook that. You just break it off the plant and eat it. And then there's popping corn, and then there's all kinds of corn of different colors, lots of different characteristics. Again, these are relatively independent lineages of corn that people have developed over time. And again, they're very different than their ancestor plant. Look at this, has multiple stalks. If you grow corn in your backyard, it has one stalk. Also, this is the inflorescence here. It has relatively few kernels, and these things are really hard. They're not very palatable. But the corn, this is the same thing. It's the inflorescence, but instead of a few kernels, it has a lot of them, and this really hard outer covering isn't there anymore. So these things you can actually bite with your teeth, unless you let them really dry, like if you were making feed corn or something like that. But you can kind of see some similarities, and really what's going on here too, that people have learned, we know the genetic bases of these differences, and usually what's going on here is people are hitting upon not huge suites of genes and alleles that code for these characters, they're hitting upon regulatory genes. And so small changes in very few genes can make big changes in morphology, completely turn on or off whole developmental cascades, like going from a multi-stem plant to a single-stem plant. Again, they don't know about the genetics of it, they're just growing things, and then the next generation you plant the seeds of the ones that have the characteristics most like what you would want, and you don't keep planting the ones that are breaking your teeth and taste awful. Okay? This is also true of animals. So we talked about our domesticated animals. People made them, but they're not made from nothing. So do anybody know what part of the world these four animals live in?
Peru?
Yeah, they live in Peru. They live in the Andes. They live in the northern Andes. Okay? They're camelids. They're in a family that includes there's 2 camels still extant in the old world. And we had camels right here in Los Angeles, okay? They're extinct. So other species of camels used to be here in the New World. They're all gone except 2 old world ones. And these 2 wild New World ones that live in the Andes, that's the Guanaco and the Vicuña. People that lived in the Andes, who lived there? There wasn't the Maya and the Aztecs. The Inca, yeah, the Inca and their ancestors, they used this animal and made 2 more that are really different. One of them they selected for characteristics of a pack animal to carry stuff, and the other they selected for its wool. Which one's which? Yeah, it's pretty obvious. If you ever get to feel really nice alpaca wool, that's just about as nice as it gets. Yeah, I'm not talking about not so much the animal, but after it's been cleaned and combed and something made out of it, spun, it's really fancy stuff. It's really nice, very high quality wool. Beats the pants off any sheep any day. And and then the llama over here. So again, these things didn't exist many thousands of years ago, less than 10,000 years ago, but these animals did, and by selective breeding of these, the Inca built 2 other animals that exist today, and they're still in use for those purposes, by this process of artificial selection. And they said that the first chapter of Darwin's Origin of Species was all about pigeons. He wrote about other things and products of artificial selection, but he knew a lot about pigeons, and I like pigeons. So are some examples of different kinds of pigeons. Again, they all come from something that's existed for a long time. This bird here called Columba livia. The wild type is also variable. Remember we saw those beetles the other day in the picture, and there were dozens of different color morphs, but they were all the same species. The wild type of this species of bird, the rock pigeon, that is from the old world, some of them are like this, and some of them are kind of checkered, but they're fairly drab and not super colorful. And then pay attention to the body form. This is the kind of the wild type, and this is mostly what you see out there in Southern California. These feral pigeons. Okay, lots of them, though, have ancestors that were these really fancy pigeons that we see about. We're going to see today. And this is another thing that happens to domesticated animals. If they're able to roam wild and exist in the wild and go what's called feral, they change, and they change back toward the wild type, okay? And that doesn't mean one, it's not like the wolf man or something like that when he gets, the boom comes up and this one individual becomes something else, or the Incredible Hulk. Do you guys know Wolfman, Incredible Hulk? Yeah. Yeah, so it's not one individual changing. Those are documentaries, right? It's not like one individual changing, so they have to go through multiple generations. But in a few generations, house cats and pigs and things like that, they go back more toward the wild type characteristics. Those genes are still there, but the combinations that were selected by people, these very specific combinations of alleles that produce a strange looking pigeon that we're going to look at here, those things, those combinations don't exist anymore. And then the old genes that are still there end up in the old wild type combinations, and you get these kind of things even from fancy pigeons just in a few generations. Okay? So here are some kinds of pigeons, again, that people have made on the order of the last few hundred years. You don't have to learn the names of these things. Just look at, the point here is that look what can be done by selective breeding, or in natural selection, we call that differential reproduction. Okay, that same process can generate very big differences in large amounts of time, but we can do very similar things, big differences in short amounts of time using artificial selection. So this is a bird here. It doesn't look that different, except the beak is kind of accentuated and the head is all kind of drawn down. Some of these breeds of pigeons people selected because they did things that they wanted. They were very good at finding their way home, so pigeons have a natural homing ability. You can take them somewhere and they'll fly home. But of course, that's a characteristic that's variable, and it's coded for in genes, and so people can really select for homing ability. They all can also select, people eat pigeons, so you would select for characteristics like tastiness and large size. And then people select for lots of characteristics that aren't very utilitarian, but they're just interesting and different. And like, has the LA County Fair started yet? Yeah, speak about hot weather. You know, if you think it's hot here, go to the LA County Fair. It's always in the fall, and it's always blazing hot out there. But you can go there and you can see people will bring their pigeons and display them, and that's a thing that's done at county fairs all across the country. Those are one of the animals that people bring to show. Just like people have show dogs, they have show pigeons. So this one has a much shorter beak and really huge, large, accentuated eyes. Okay, and it's not just the eye. Remember that it has a skull in there, and so if you were to take the skull out of that other bird and take the one out of this and clean everything off, and they would look very different. Okay, they're very different looking kinds of creatures, and yet they're all the same thing. They're all the same species. Yeah. So here's one that have really short beaks And then there are genes that code for how the feathers grow and how the feathers lie. And lots of them, the feathers are twisted or they form these little hoods. Okay, we'll see some that have really big hoods on them. But this isn't, it just didn't like slept on the pillow wrong or something like that. This one's always like this. Okay, it's just like this. They call they're different kinds. They call these owls because they kind of have the appearance a little bit of an owl, another kind of bird. Here's one that has really twisted feathers, particularly all over its back and on the dorsal side of its wings. And notice down here, when we look at the wild type, the feathers on the legs stop about right here. But they still have scales all the way down to the end of their toes and where their nails are. And in some of these birds, the genes that code for feathers, they're still there, but now they're turned on and they produce feathers down here on their feet. Just like they have those dogs that instead of producing hair, they don't have hair at all. You know, and so those are regulatory genes that code for big effects. And if you can hit upon those alleles or combinations of alleles for those genes, you can see very big differences. This one really accentuated these tissues. At the base of the beak and around the eye are these tissues that's called a cere, C-E-R-E. And so those are there on the wild type, they're just not very big. But in this one here, this barb, they're very accentuated, so much so that you can't even really see the beak there because it's all covered by this cere. And here's an English carrier looking at you, and it's the same way. The cere around the eyes is accentuated, and the same stuff all over the beak is very accentuated. And then this one, it's kind of a different body form. It's really almost like you took the thing and it was made out of clay, and you stretched it out a little bit. This has very long, pointy wings, and this one's called a swift because, like those ones called owls, they look like there are some natural, regular birds that are called swifts, and they have these kinds of wings. Also, notice the plasticity and just the feather color. Okay, so the wild type has one kind of grayish and black color with some metallic reflections, but there are genes and alleles in there in combinations for lots of different color expressions. And this is a whole group that are called touters, and their crop is really inflated. Now if you watch these birds around campus, they'll do this too. The males will do it when they're courting the females. And so they'll puff out their crop and they'll fill it with air and they'll sing, they go and then they'll put their tail on the ground and go That's something we'll talk about later in this class, but he wants to be looked at. And sometimes it doesn't even look like she's looking, but she is paying attention and she's sizing him up. She's making decisions about if she's going to mate with this bird, or if she does mate with this bird, am I going to use his sperm or am I going to mate again? So she really is paying attention. But in these birds, they're kind of puffed out all the time, so much so that they can't even see. They can't even see down here because their crop is all kind of puffed out like this. So here's another one. It's all stretched out, same sort of thing, but really skinny body. And then this one has some pretty well-developed feathers on its feet. And then this is one of the tumblers. There are a bunch of pigeons that are called tumblers, and that's because when they fly, so this is a genetically based behavioral characteristic. So when you have regular homing pigeons and you fly them around the neighborhood, they go in big circles and they fly around for a long time. The tumblers, they go up in the air and they start flying real high, and then they just start rolling. There are tumblers and rollers. They just start rolling, and then before they hit the ground, they catch themselves and go back up and do that again. It's a weird behavioral characteristic, and then when people discovered that, they just kept breeding those, and then they had birds that flew and behaved in that way. This one and these fantails that we'll see also have way more feathers in their tail. If you shoot one of these pigeons on campus and pick it up, it's not going to let you do it, unless you subdue it somehow. Hold its tail and splay it out, and it has 12 tail feathers. This tumbler here and this fantail, they have twice as many feathers. So there must be some gene in there that codes it's like a doubling, you know, it's like maybe in the cells, as the cells that give rise to the cells that give rise to the tail feathers are reproducing, it's like they all reproduced one more time and made a double amount of those things, and hence they make twice as many tail feathers, and you get these birds that are called fantails. These also are not, remember we were making jokes about putting dairy cattle out on the plains of East Africa, and they wouldn't do so good. So these things also, they don't do so good in the wild. They're not very good at flying, they're not very good at escaping predators, and so when you let lots of these kinds of things go, or it's even true of lots of kinds of pets, turning them loose is a terrible thing to do because they're not good as individuals and as little lineages of things that have been selected for other traits. They're not so good at dealing with the wild, and they get picked off real easy. Or they just flat out can't find food because they're used to getting it from the bowl in the corner of my cage. That's where food is. And if they're not there, they don't get it. These are Jacobins, after a group of monks called Jacobin monks that would wear big hoods that cover most of their face. And in this case, it's feathers. So really accentuated feathers around the cage. See, this one's had it, but it's in there. And so very accentuated feathers around their head. And these aren't very good flyers. And along with this goes these really long, very long wings. They're not so good at flying. And then here's another one of these tumblers, but look at this one here. This is really pretty. And then it has, again, some weird feather arrangement up here, and then really large accentuated feathers on the feet. Okay, again, the genes that code for feathers, they're still there. In the wild type, they're all turned off. In these, they're turned on, and they're turned on to a great degree. That these are as big as some of the feathers, that the primary flight feathers that you see on the wings. Okay, any questions about artificial selection and our quick review of natural selection? Yes.
So that was all pigeons.
All of those birds that I showed you are all one species. They're all, even these fancy kinds, they're all one species called Columbolivia. They're just different breeds of the same thing. So we can have big Irish wolfhounds and dachshunds and chihuahuas and terriers and German shepherds.